The snow didn't sting as much as their words. Clara Hale kept her eyes on the uneven track ahead, the pale light of a dying day turning the drifts a bruised gray. Her boots, once her brother's cast-offs, had worn to thin leather at the toes, and each step pressed raw skin against the ice. The ragged shawl clung to her shoulders, stiff in places where frost had crept into the weave. She had been walking since dawn, leaving behind the creak of the Hale homestead's door, the smell of smoke from the hearth she would never sit beside again. She carried little, a dented tin cup hooked to her belt, a Bible tucked into her satchel, and a strip of jerky wrapped in brown paper. The jerky was for tomorrow, if she saw it. Wind lifted the ends of her hair, tangling it across her cheeks, but she didn't bother to push it away. She could still hear her father's voice, flat as the hardpan earth in summer, telling her there was no place for her under his roof if she would not wed the man he had chosen. Her mother had said nothing, only stared at the worn floorboards as though they might open and swallow her whole. Clara had waited for a moment of hesitation, a hand to reach for her, but instead there had been the scrape of a boot turning away and the click of the latch behind her. The ache in her chest had outlasted the cold. Each mile was a tally in her mind. A mile since the farm, 2 miles since she'd last looked over her shoulder, 3 miles since she'd swallowed the urge to cry. The land stretched out in pale silence, broken only by the brittle skeletons of fence posts and the distant rise of hills under a low sky. It was atop one of those ridges that she saw him, a dark shape against the fading light, a rider in a long brown duster with a rifle laid across the saddle. The horse's breath came in slow plumes. The man's had pulled low to shade eyes she couldn't yet see. He didn't slow as he approached, the rhythm of hoofbeats steady, purposeful. When his gaze met hers, it was brief, measuring, unreadable, and then the horse carried him past, snow hissing under iron shoes. She turned to watch him go, a solitary figure melting back into the gray horizon. Her legs grew heavier as the day bled toward night. The wind carried the dry scent of hay and rotting timber to her, and soon the outline of a barn took shape in the dusk. It sagged to one side, its roof torn open in places, but it was shelter enough. She slipped through the gap, where the doors no longer met, and found herself in the shadowy hush of old wood. Broken boards leaned against the far wall, and a scattering of straw lay in one corner, brittle and smelling faintly of summers long gone. Kneeling, she reached for her satchel and pulled the Bible free. The pages near the back held the printed index, lists of places and names she had never known, and she tore them carefully. Each rip muffled under the wind's moan through the cracks. She built a small pile, struck a match from the tiny box she carried, and fed the flame until it licked and curled over the paper. The light painted her face in amber, and for a few moments she felt the ghost of warmth against her fingers. Beyond the barn wall, snow crunched. She stilled, the matchbox still in her hand. Through a jagged gap in the boards, she saw the faint glow of another fire, set low and steady. A man's silhouette moved against it, the rider she had passed on the trail. He crouched, feeding a branch into the coals, his coat flaring slightly with emotion. The rifle rested nearby, within easy reach. He hadn't left the area after all. She turned back to her own meager fire, feeding it a final page. The thought of company in the empty night was both comfort and threat. Men in these parts were as likely to offer harm as help, and the weight of her father's warning, spoken without words, but with a lifetime of instruction, pressed against her mind. She sat with her knees drawn up, the flames casting shifting light on the warped beams above, and told herself she didn't care who he was or why he lingered. Still, she could feel his eyes on her through the darkness, not the eyes of a man who wanted something, but of one deciding whether to step into another person's troubles. The barn groaned under the wind. A loose shingle clattered to the frozen ground outside. Clara pulled the shawl tighter and lay on the straw, curling into herself. She stared at the tiny fire until it burned down to a weak orange glow, the smell of scorched paper fading into the cold air. Somewhere outside, the horse shifted and snorted, and she heard the muffled thump of the man's boots as he moved about. The night pressed in. Between the cracks in the boards, the other fire's glow flickered on and off as if the wind were trying to snuff it out. She wondered if he watched hers fade in the same way, if he measured her resolve by how long she kept it alive. Her hands ached from the cold, but she didn't rebuild the fire. She closed her eyes and listened to the barn's wooden bones creak around her. If he meant to speak, he would have by now. If he meant to help, he would have already walked through the barn door. And if he meant harm, the quiet wouldn't last. She drifted toward sleep with the taste of iron in her mouth from the frozen air, the shawl stiff against her cheek, and the faint, steady sound of another human's presence in the wilderness. It was not comfort, not yet, but it was something. The sun was pale and sharp over the rim of the hills when Clara stepped onto the main street of Three Pines. The snow had thinned here, churned to slush by wagon wheels and boots, leaving a stripe of wet earth down the middle of the road. Wooden fronts leaned toward one another like tired old men, their paint long since scoured away by wind and dust. A dog nosed at a scrap of paper in the gutter, then slunk into an alley. She kept her head down and her eyes on the livery first. Inside, the smell of manure and old hay wrapped around her, almost comforting. She asked the man tending a chestnut mare if there was work, mucking stalls, carrying feed, anything. His gaze swept over her in one slow, dismissive motion. Then he shook his head and turned away. No explanation, just a soft spit into the straw. The laundry was next, its windows fogged from the heat inside. The woman who answered her knock opened the door only a sliver, enough to let a sharp scent of soap escape. At the sight of Clara, her mouth pinched. "Hale's girl," she said like the words were sour, and closed the door without waiting for a reply. By the time Clara reached the saloon, her legs ached and her throat burned with thirst. The light inside was dim, golden through the haze of tobacco smoke. A piano tinkled somewhere toward the back, half-hearted and off-key. She'd barely stepped inside when a man in a sweat-stained shirt caught her by the wrist. His grip was hard, his breath worse, and the laughter around him swelled like it was all part of the show. "Pretty thing," he slurred. "Oughta buy me a drink." The bartender glanced their way, shrugged, and went back to polishing a glass. Clara tried to twist free, but his fingers dug deeper. She didn't speak. Words wouldn't loosen his hand, so she just stared at his jaw until he finally let go with a chuckle. The skin under her shawl throbbed, and she walked out without looking back, holding her arm close to her side. In the corner of the saloon, under the shadow of his hat, Elias Boone had watched it all. His hands were still on the table, one beside a half-empty glass, the other resting near the brim of his hat. He didn't move, didn't call out, didn't so much as narrow his eyes, just followed her with his gaze as she stepped into the light outside. On the boardwalk, she passed him without knowing. He was leaning against a post now, coat collar turned up against the wind. When the gust caught her shawl and sent it sliding off her shoulder, he didn't reach for it, just watched her pull it back into place herself, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. By nightfall, the town had gone quiet except for the echo of boots on planks and the faint laughter spilling from a saloon. Clara found her way to the church, its door unlocked. The pews smelled faintly of old varnish, and the cold seemed to settle thicker inside than out. She lay down on the last bench, curling against the wood, pulling the shawl over herself like a shield. Sometime in the dark, she stirred. Her hand brushed something under the fold of cloth, a crust of bread, wrapped in paper, and a small tin flask of water. No sound in the church, but the faint groan of the rafters. No note. She sat up slowly, scanning the shadows, her eyes lingering on the dark corners between pews. The bread was dry and the water metallic, but she ate and drank it all, swallowing slowly as if tasting for meaning in every mouthful. Morning brought a wind that scoured the streets clean. She stepped out into its bite, heading nowhere in particular. At the sound of shouts, she turned to see a wagon lurching toward her, one wheel spinning free in the ruts, the horse screaming against the reins. She froze, her mind empty but for the sudden rush of hoofbeats. A hand caught her arm, pulling her out of the path, so quickly her boots scraped the dirt. Elias Boone stood beside her, the door of the general store swinging shut behind him. His eyes were pale in the daylight, sharp and steady, the kind of gaze that didn't flinch. He said nothing, only looked at her for a moment longer than comfort allowed, then let go. Her arm was still tingling when she murmured, "Thank you," her voice barely carrying. He gave no sign he'd heard and walked away. That night, snow began to fall again, heavy and wet, sticking to her hair and lashes. She found herself in the narrow alley behind the blacksmith shop, trying to make a bed against the wall where the wind couldn't reach. The ground was hard, the snow seeping through her skirt, but it was better than the church pew. Boot steps stopped at the mouth of the alley. She looked up, heart knocking once, then twice. Elias stood there, snow catching in the lines of his coat. He didn't speak, didn't move closer, just jerked his chin toward the livery stable across the street. She hesitated, unsure if she'd imagined it, but his eye stayed on hers until she pushed herself up. They crossed the street together in silence, the storm muffling even the sound of their boots. Inside the stable, the smell of hay wrapped around them, the air warmer from the breath of the horses shifting in their stalls. He pointed toward a corner where fresh straw had been laid down. She nodded once, set her satchel at her side, and lowered herself onto it. He busied himself with checking the tack on his horse, saying nothing more. The only sound was the creak of leather, the slow snort of the animal, and the wind beating futilely against the stable walls. They didn't look at each other again before sleep took her, but she could feel him there, close enough that the dark didn't seem quite so empty. The air in the saloon was thick with smoke and the sour heat of whiskey. Clara had only stepped inside to get warm, her shawl damp from the wet snow outside, but before she could find a quiet corner, the ranch hand was on her again. His eyes were glassy, his grin too wide, and the stench of liquor clung to him like sweat. "There she is," he said loudly, his words slurred but sharp enough to draw attention. "Little thief thought she could rob me blind." She froze, caught between the urge to leave and the knowledge that running would only feed his lie. Around them, a few men chuckled, and the bartender leaned against the counter as if settling in to watch a play. Clara shook her head, the movement small but firm. "I didn't take anything." He stepped closer, backing her toward the wall. "Sure you didn't. My coins went missing the same day you were hanging around." A ripple of laughter moved through the room, mean and quick. No one moved to help. She could feel the wood of the wall against her back now, could hear her own heartbeat over the piano's lazy tune. The man's shadow swallowed hers. The saloon door swung open, letting in a knife of cold air. The music faltered, boots thudded against the floor, slow and heavy. Elias Boone stepped inside, brushing snow from his hat brim. His eyes took in the scene without hurry, lingering on the ranch hand, then on Clara. He didn't speak. The ranch hand grinned wider, tilting his head toward Elias. "You know this little stray? I reckon she's—" "You're talking to my honor now," Elias said, the words cutting clean through the noise. The room went still. The laughter died mid-breath. Even the piano player stopped, his fingers hovering over the keys. The ranch hand's smirk faltered. Elias didn't move toward his gun, but his hand rested on the worn grip, casual as if it had always been there. His gaze stayed on the man until the space between them felt too small for both of them. The ranch hand muttered something and stepped back, his boots scuffing against the warped boards. Elias shifted just enough to stand between Clara and the rest of the saloon. He didn't look at her, didn't offer an explanation. He simply reached for her hand, his palm rough and warm against her cold skin, and led her toward the door. Outside, the snow had thickened into a steady curtain. He didn't speak as they walked down the street, past shuttered storefronts and dimly lit windows. The only sound was the crunch of their boots and the wind sighing through the eaves. She didn't ask where they were going. The way his hand held hers made the question unnecessary. The last of the town's lamps fell behind them, and soon the glow of a small fire through a single window appeared ahead. The house was low and weathered, its roof bowed slightly with age, but it stood firm against the wind. He pushed the door open, the hinges complaining softly. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of pine smoke. A low fire burned in the stone hearth, shadows dancing along the plank walls. On a chair near the fire lay a folded cavalry coat, its blue faded to gray, brass buttons dulled with time. Beside it sat a small frame daguerreotype, a young woman with a calm smile, a child perched in her lap. Both faces looked out at the world from another life. Elias set her shawl over the back of a chair and moved toward the stove. He poured coffee into a tin cup, slid a plate with thick slices of bread toward her. She sat, her fingers curling around the cup, letting the heat soak in. The fire popped, a log shifting in the grate. He didn't ask questions, and she didn't offer answers. They ate in silence, the kind that filled rather than emptied a room. The days that followed carried their own rhythm. She rose early, drawn to the sound of him moving outside. She mended the fence where the posts leaned, her fingers stiff with cold but steady. She brought water to his horse, brushing snow from its mane, murmuring softly to it as though it were an old friend. Inside, she swept the floor, her skirt stirring dust motes in the shafts of morning light. He worked nearby, sharpening the edge of a spade, splitting logs with the even swing of an axe. Sometimes she felt his eyes on her from the porch, but when she glanced up, he'd already be looking elsewhere, as if the moment had never existed. One dawn, she stepped outside to find the world hushed under fresh snow. The air was sharp, the light just beginning to touch the tops of the trees. She paused at the edge of the porch, her breath curling in front of her, and saw it, her name, carved neat and deliberate into the wood of the railing. The letters were small, tucked close to the post, as though meant to be seen only by her. She traced the grooves with her fingertip, the cold biting into her skin. Somewhere behind her, the door creaked, and she heard the slow tread of boots on the porch boards. He didn't speak, and neither did she. The moment was enough. By mid-morning, the whispers had already curled through the town, like wood smoke. Folks on the boardwalk leaned against posts, pretending to whittle or sweep, their eyes following the road that led to Elias Boone's ranch. They said he'd claimed her, the saloon girl, the wanderer, the one who never stayed in one place long enough for roots to take. Some said it like scandal, others like prophecy. Clara didn't much care which it was. She was mending a tear in his curtain when the sound of distant hooves rolled in like approaching thunder. 3 riders came over the rise. The lead one slouched in his saddle like a man who thought the world bent under his boot heel. The ranch hand from the saloon wore a grin slick with malice, and 2 others flanked him, the kind of men whose eyes didn't rest on anything unless they meant to take it. They didn't dismount when they reached the porch. Dust hung in the air around them, the cold wind pushing it toward the cabin door. The lead man spat over the side of his horse. "Boone," he said, drawing the name out like he was chewing it. "We come for the girl. She owes the Hale family debts she can't pay." Elias stood on the porch, his coat unbuttoned despite the bite in the air, one hand resting near his belt, but not on the revolver. His gaze was steady, unblinking. "She's my honor now," he said, the words slow and measured. "You want her, you go through me." The ranch hand laughed, a short, ugly sound, but there was no mirth in it. His companions shifted in their saddles, glancing at one another. Elias didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there like the land itself, unmoving, unshakable. The wind picked up, tugging at the brim of his hat. For a long, taut moment, the only sound was the creak of leather and the restless snort of a horse. Then, as if some silent line had been drawn and respected, the lead man spat into the dirt. Without a word, they turned their mounts, hooves thudding in rhythm until the sound faded down the trail. Inside, Clara sat at the table, hands tight in her lap. She'd been holding her breath without realizing it. When the door closed behind him, Elias set his hat on the table and leaned against the wall, his face unreadable. "Ain't no going back," he said quietly. She met his eyes and nodded once, her voice gone. That was all. The days that followed carried the weight of unspoken truths. The snow came early that year, a slow, steady drift that softened the hard edges of the land. Clara kept busy, baking bread, stacking firewood, patching his worn shirt cuffs, and Elias worked the fences, his silhouette moving slow against the white horizon. They spoke when needed, but more often they didn't, letting the silence between them take root like something alive. One afternoon, she stepped onto the porch to shake out a blanket and saw him there, a knife in hand, leaning over the railing. The sound of steel against wood was soft but deliberate. He didn't look up as she came closer, But when she glanced down, she saw her name carved into the rail, neat and sure, Seaboon. Beside it, as though it had been waiting, was his own, Eboon. The letters caught the pale light of winter, their edges sharp and clean. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Weeks passed, the snow deepening around the cabin until the world beyond the fence seemed swallowed by white. Life settled into a rhythm that felt both fragile and unshakable. The morning steam of coffee rising between them, the creak of floorboards as one passed the other, the quiet moments by the fire when shadows brushed across their faces. On a still morning in late winter, the sky heavy with unfallen snow, Clara stepped out onto the porch beside him. The railing felt cold under her palm. Their hands didn't touch, but they were close enough that the warmth of him reached her through the chill. She looked out across the land, where the horizon blurred into pale sky, and felt something settle deep in her chest. Not quite peace, but the promise of it. The wind stirred, catching the corner of her old shawl, where it hung from her shoulders. It lifted away like a slow bird, spinning once before the whiteness took it. Neither of them moved to catch it. They stood there instead, side by side, the snow beginning to fall again, their names side by side in the rail, a quiet truth carved into wood that would outlast the season.